Welcome to Read the Source, your open source hangout on Google for like companion for open source on GitHub and all sorts of other places. So we have some people from Famous today, some great engineers, Zach Brown and Trevor, I'm going to butcher your name, Bossert?
Yes.
Bossert, okay. So you guys are engineers on the team. So we're going to be looking through some code that you guys have for an upcoming release. So part of this code will be available to be able to view now, and we'll have the GitHub links for that. And some of it will be available, or the rest will be available within the next couple of months. So you guys will be able to piece it all together at that point. So do you guys want to say a little bit about yourselves and you know, what you guys do on the team first, and then go into it?
Sure. So again, my name is Trevor Bossert. I am the lead DevOps manager engineer here. Basically, my role here is to provide a bridge between the operation side and the developer side, and to help provide a tool set for developers to basically increase the rapid development of their software cycles, and then manage the infrastructure.
And I'm Zach Brown. I'm the VP of Engineering. My job here is to bridge the business needs with the engineering execution. And I also do some of the architecture for some of our projects.
Okay. And where is the code available for people to go to for now?
So we have a GitHub link to github.com/famouscommunity/framework API preview. Now this is just the developer-facing API, and it's just a preview. There's no library attached to this code, but you can get a pretty good sense of how the pieces come together by checking this out.
Okay.
It'll make more sense with a bit more context after we sort of talk about the container model and then dive in.
And the container model, like, is kind of new for a lot of people. I know Steve Newcomb, when he was on the Web Platform podcast, kind of described it as Docker for the front end. So when we go through this, is there anything like that we could relate it to, as far as like, is there pieces of it that are Flash? Because I saw you have an animation timeline and some other pieces in there.
So the container, so the timeline stuff and all that is more in the engine section of the code, which will run inside of the container. It's part of the mixed mode engine.
Mm-hmm.
But what the container basically is it's an embeddable project that you can put as a tag on any website page, and allows it to inject as an iframe content loaded from, could be from our hub cloud services or from another location, but allows you to have basically an entry point on a page where you can change the code at a separate serving location and have it pulled in as a project as you develop, without having to actually touch the live web page and manage that code, which is very good for a lot of larger companies that have longer release cycles where you can't actually touch the code on this page and you have to go through several levels of developers to get anything changed. Where in this way, you know, a contractor or, you know, just a quick development change can be made quickly without having to really be in that process.
That sounds great. All right, so if you guys want to screen share, let's get going and see what this is looking like. It sounds awesome.
Sure. Sure. One more detail on that ability to push code out. Like a reference product you could think of is Heroku. Heroku is really rich for server-side code, pushing out, say, a Rails app and deploying it.
Right.
We're bringing that same sort of functionality to the front end in a containerized way.
Exactly, trying to basically empower the developers, and also, you know, eventually with the, you know, low code, no code people to be able to also push out changes and make changes to like widgets or things like that very quickly, so that they don't have to go through as many levels.
All right, thanks, guys.
So maybe one more bit of prelude before the code itself. I'll just share my entire screen. Well, hey.
Quick, turn it off.
Well, okay, so in order to support in order to support the container model, I guess one of the first hurdles that comes with the container model is that the code is embedded in an iframe. So we have sort of this black box that, like a sandbox that you just can't get in or out of for the most part. Traditionally, you cannot reach in to this box with JavaScript and then manipulate it or get stuff out of it without the post message API, which can be pretty difficult to work with if you're not expecting to work with it. So traditional JavaScript apps will hit a brick wall around an iframe. Does that make sense? Is that clear? Like if
yeah, iframes are totally encapsulated, so you'd need something like JSON-P to communicate or some socket or something.
Yeah, exactly. And if we're developing a web app and say we want to embed a little AngularJS application inside of a React application, it's doable. You could do it in an iframe, and then you could set up a messaging interface through post message that would allow you to sort of treat this iframe, the application inside, as a black box, which would be really nice, but you tend to have to go really out of your way to take an MVC style application, or even to an extent React, which expects an entire sort of hierarchy inside one React application. It takes quite a bit of effort to expose that black box. Is that clear?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So in order to mitigate that, and in a large part to support that container model, we have sort of gone back to the drawing board on MVC itself and said, how can we develop a framework that really supports this model? It's a highly event-driven model, again, to support post-message as a first-class sort of notion. How can we build a framework that supports that model and that can work with containers? So this is where the framework comes in, and these are the code samples that we have. Instead of slicing an application traditionally into M and V and C, which actually looks more like M, C, D in practice, where you have, for any given module, maybe you have let's say this is my cat. This is my cat component, and what it does is it does CRUD on cats on some database. I might have my cat model, which communicates with my cat's controller, which propagates stuff out to a cat's view. And then, so I pull cats in from a database, marshal it with the controller, push stuff out to a view. A user can come in, can change some cats, can commit it through the controller, and then persist it back through the model. So that's MVC in a nutshell for a given component. For a given component in framework, in the framework layer of the famous open source project, instead of drawing those lines between M and V and C, we draw lines between application state, between application behavior, between a declarative representation of the render tree or just the hierarchy of an application, and then between events which shuttle information around and which are able to mutate state.
So the tree is a separate HTML file, or is it a block of code?
Well, here we have some code.
Woohoo!
Yay! So the tree, yeah, as it turns out, HTML is a very elegant and widely supported format for representing a tree. But this could just as well be JSON, right? Like XML and JSON are two-way convertible. You could imagine having a like element tag, UI element, children element tag div, right? You can imagine a JSON schema that is equivalent with HTML, right? And is a means of representing
without the hyphens. Without the hyphens, yeah.
Or with strings, I suppose.
Yes, you could do it that way. Yes, for sure.
So you can imagine like a two-way compatible tree format there, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we chose to represent this tree using HTML but there's a little bit of a jump here, HTML, like a mental leap that needs to be made. We're using HTML as simply as a declaration of hierarchy. And then it passes through to traditional HTML. Any other snippets, any other frameworks, any other components can be brought in. Have you ever had a chance to work with Famous, Eric? Like our current project?
Only playing with it, to be honest. I haven't done anything more than the examples that are on the university.
Okay. Well, the idea is that we have a render tree. It's a hierarchy of components. And transformations can be applied to these, again, hierarchically. So you could have, a parent node and several descendant nodes. And if you apply, say, a rotate to this parent, it will rotate the entire scene graph beneath it, all of its descendants. However, if you apply a rotate to this guy, it will not affect this, nor will it affect this. It will only affect its descendants.
If only CSS transforms worked that way, right?
Exactly. That's a huge part of the premise of Famous. And this is a model that's really common in game engines. And again, part of our core premise is look at the expressiveness of a game engine and look at how against the grain it usually is to build an interactive application in HTML and CSS. You find yourself sort of bursting the seams of what HTML and CSS are intended to do the moment you want to, say, vertically align text, or get something to track a mouse cursor or a touch, or try to bring in physics, or any sort of computation, or anything that's non-deterministic. A lot of the stuff that modern applications require for rich interactions is fundamentally against the grain of what HTML and CSS were originally intended for, which is documents. So yes, I agree with you. If only CSS transforms worked that way. And then rather than dwell on that, we made a solution, and that's Famous. So why don't we look at this code a little? This is like a hello world example. Very straightforward. We have a UI element which represents a member of the render tree in Famous. This is built on top of our core engine, which we've been calling mix mode. So this will create a mix mode node with a DOM element attached to it. The content of that DOM element will be a div that says hello Famous. And then sort of hand waving for a moment over how these styles are applied. This will be the CSS applied to this div. These will be the Famous behaviors that are applied to it. It'll be aligned in the center of the screen. And let's see what it looks like. It looks Famous. Pretty straightforward, right?
Well, I mean, just for people who aren't so savvy with the library, myself included, could you go through some of the JavaScript that's on the side?
Sure thing. So back to this guy for a second. We have behaviors, event, state, and tree for any given module. In this case, we have probably be renaming this to module. This code is in alpha status right now, so there are a few changes coming down the pipe. But this is the name of the module. Super Demo Day is essentially an org, like an organization or a user namespace. Hello Famous is the name of the module. For this given module, just like an MVC module would have a model and a view and a controller, there's a set of behaviors, events, states, and a tree, which in this case points to this external file, this HTML file. The state of the application in this case is empty. There's no particularly interesting state because there's no interactions. There's just a default state of the application. So we can delve a little bit more into that in a different example. The event similarly is an empty set for this particular example. There's no interaction. But this showcases the behaviors. Like CSS and HTML, we have drawn a line, an abstraction between the declaration of a set of behaviors and the declaration of a set of elements, in this case, the tree. In CSS, you have, say, a background color red that's applied to some div. In our case, we have an align that is applied to some render tree element. And it turns out that there's a standardized means of addressing an arbitrary set of elements in an HTML tree, and that is called selectors. So exactly the same way that CSS and HTML can be divided into separate purposes and separate concerns, the behaviors and the declaration of the tree in the famous framework are separate concerns.
So when something like this uses align, right, I don't see that as a standard rule in CSS, obviously. So, I mean, you look at it and you're like, well, what's really happening? Are you using the standard DOM tree, or is this going to WebGL or whatever in there?
So this is all famous. Align is a famous concept.
Okay.
So that's what it looks like if I align the whole thing to 0.75, 0.75 instead of 0.5, 0.5.
Interesting.
Yep. And so you could
so this
do
isn't anything.
like
this isn't new, then, is what I'm getting at from the framework. This is from this whole work in the old famous prior to 1.3.5, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Very cool. Sorry to go over there, but it's interesting. And as far as like, I noticed you had scene as the name, right? And then you said it'll be changed to module probably. So when I think of scenes, I think of Flash, and I think of timelines that way. And that's one thing that we've really been missing, I think, from CSS and dealing with the fallout of Flash and trying to have some sort of sanity to creating these really graphical elements. So is that something that you guys thought about when you were creating this?
Yeah, absolutely. On a personal note, I cut my teeth on Flash. That was where I really learned to code after the TA83 calculator, I guess. And what I really loved about it personally was the interactive environment, how visual everything was, and the fact that you can start with visual tools and progress into adding snippets of code. For example, you can draw a circle on the stage in Flash and turn it into a symbol, and then animate it on a timeline, which is cool, totally visual. But then you can go in and be like, now I want you to sort of oscillate on some sine wave as you're moving across this timeline. And Flash supports that. It's really a designer to developer bridge, and it empowers someone who's learning very visually to create interactive stuff. So personal note aside, when Flash was sort of more or less unilaterally thrown in the gutter by Apple when they declared that they would not support it on mobile, that left a gaping hole in the market. Web, candidly, has not caught up to Flash in terms of the authoring experience, in terms of the expressiveness of that authoring experience. And that expressiveness and that empowerment is one of our #1 aims with what we're doing with Framework, and ultimately with a visual IDE that will be built on top of Framework.
Very cool. Yeah, there's been some leaps and bounds the past year, but it still isn't where Flash was. So I totally feel your pain. This is great.
So one of the goals of Framework here is that these 4 components, again, EE, S, and T, state is purely declarative. It's just a JSON blob. This one's also empty with state. Let's go clickable square. So if I pull up the clickable square example, this is a very simple component that I can click, and it increments a number. Very, very simple. The flow for that is there's a tree with a simple single element. There are events attached to that tree element. So our square selector attaches a UI click event handler to this UI element, square. On that click, I want to mutate a piece of state, in this case, number of clicks. Number of clicks is declared here as a state. So states is just a declarative JSON blob. On click, number of clicks is incremented. States are injected into behaviors. In this case, our content behavior. And our content is a function of that state, number of clicks. As a result, we have our full cycle here, and then our behavior is attached to the square. So as a result, I can click on the square, fires an event, updates the state, which updates the behavior, which updates the output. If I wanted this behavior to instead be mount point, or align, or background color, or rotation, all of those work just as well. The idea is that CSS is a little too static for, actually way too static for richly interactive applications. And we need term completeness that only JavaScript can provide. So that was one of the aims of Framework. And then back to here, the state is purely declarative. The tree itself is purely declarative. The behaviors are purely functional, which makes them declarative in their own way. They should have no side effects, which means we can do interesting stuff, sort of analyzing their abstract syntax tree, which gives us some power moving forward. But that's a future feature. And then events are essentially just code snippets. This is the one place where you do standard procedural code. This all leads up to an IDE that can be built on top of this framework. You can imagine a visual editor for a JSON blob for states. You can imagine a visual editor for a hierarchical tree. So this is the move we're making toward Flash, or a Flash-like experience for the web.
Very nice. Now with these, I saw that it's like, it looks like a custom element basically from web component standards, but you said it's in iframes, correct?
Yes.
Yep.
So if I were to look at the code in the browser, like if you went into the console and looked at that, would that render as an iframe and then just have some ID based on that? So it's more like a developer experience rather than looking at the code that it generates.
You can see the code just as you can in any iframe. You can delve into the code. For the exploration aspect, there's no difference, but the embedding aspect.
So it wraps it is what I'm saying, right? Then it wraps it, and it wraps it in an iframe. Because earlier you said you had iframes for this, right?
Mm-hmm. So the iframe is an optional tool here.
Oh, okay.
Communication between components is handled strictly with events, and there's strictly zero shared state between any components in this application architecture, which means whether a component is embedded in an iframe, back to this bit, this sort of post-message bit, by the design constraints of the framework, the black box is already exposed for any given framework component using the best architecture pattern. It already exposes inputs and outputs, sort of like a SMD chip that you can embed on like a circuit board. It has a set of input pins and output pins, and everything inside is a black box. Okay. So the deployment mechanism, though, for the containers, Trevor can speak more to that, and sort of the back-end integration that we can have with this.
Yeah, I mean the idea with containers is that you could, like I said, you can embed projects, and you can have you could have 5 or 6 different containers throughout different places on the page to serve different content. And you can host them in, like I said, we're going to have a hub cloud services, which is going to be this really nice CDN delivery network and code management bit that will allow you to work on your local machine, push, and you're like, all right, I got a new one that I want to show off on the site, be able to run a push command, and it updates to the latest version of the project on our servers, and then suddenly you load that page and you'll see the refreshed content. And that's kind of the ideas with containers, is that you don't have to go take your code and edit the live page to see the changes. You could just push up a new item to this container and you'll see it immediately, and you can change different versions, and it allows you to do a lot of really cool things like A/B testing and get a lot of really useful analytics about what's going on around that container.
So imagine that Martin the marketer comes in to, I guess I'll go back to screen share. Let's say that Martin the marketer comes in and has the ability to twiddle some simple editor controls, like a, in fact, I think I have a visual for this. So this guy right here, imagine that there's an interface like this that a non-coding person can come in and change values for. Like, oh, I want to change the size of this thing, or the margin, or the text, or the link. And then they can just save their changes. Visually, no need for redeployment, no need for any of the tricky bits, the technical in the sense of technician bits that come with a lot of software engineering. So once they deploy it live, they can come back and say like, oh, actually, I want to see what it's like. I want to see what conversions are like, on our site if the size is 500 instead of 250. Traditionally, you have, like, Martin the marketer has to go to a development team and say, like, guys, I want an A/B test to see which converts better, like size 250 or size 500. Set this up for me. It takes them maybe half a week of effort. They put it out there, and then you wait another 2 weeks, and then you finally get results, and then they have to go sort of clean up the A/B tests. It's a mess. It's extremely wasteful, and it's unnecessary that Martin the marketer should have to interface with that engineering team at all, when all he really wants to do is see if size 500 or size 250 converts better. So that's part of the power of the container, is that we remove a lot of the need for the developer in the middle of these needs at all.
Right. Yeah, it's just kind of hard to see without seeing all of the pieces together.
Of course.
So.
Of course. Yeah. Well, so in terms of our product release schedule, we are releasing in echelon, sort of one piece at a time. We are releasing the engine itself, the core mixed mode rendering engine first. Then we are releasing this framework layer. These two pieces are the famous open source project. So the framework layer builds on top of the engine. And then the framework optionally integrates with our hosting and cloud services, which we're calling Hub. And that's all of the sort of server-side aspects. But all of this is totally runnable, open source out of the box without the need for the services. Our goal is just that it makes sense to use the services, that it just makes everyone's life easier.
And it'll all be MIT, which is awesome.
Correct.
Okay, so you have a bunch of examples here.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the other ones that you have that are something different than what we're seeing here?
So I think the timeline is one worth checking out, especially with the way that it's building toward a Flash-like rich designer-developer experience. So in this case, we have a little circle, a medium circle, and a large circle in our tree. We have our declaration, behaviors, events, states, and then a link to that tree. We've built sort of a timeline syntactic sugar module that can sit on top. It sort of straddles the behaviors and the state bits of the application. So we've given it sort of a separate layer. And this is purely declarative. Again, you can imagine a visual editor that can come in and change these timeline values. The core thing that you're doing when you're creating an animation timeline is you're assembling a piecewise function. So you have a domain, a time domain. It's like the ticker on the timeline. It's going to go from, say, 0 to 100%. This is your domain. And then for the different values that you want a timeline, say the size of the circle over this time, you have a range of values. So at time 0, I want my range, for domain 0, I want my range to be 200, 200. For domain 25%, I want my range to be 400, 400. And with Flash, with any visual timelining tool, like this is essentially what's happening under the covers. But thinking in terms of piecewise functions is fairly complex. So that's why visual timeline tools exist at all. But this timeline DSL is a way of assembling those in a fairly intuitive way, and then binding them to your application. And the result is
now if I'm if I'm Martin sorry to interrupt, but if I'm Martin the marketer and I have this on my page, does this code generate my interface that I could use?
So ultimately, we have longer term plans for a full on visual creation environment, but we're in investigational stages for that right now. So where it would start right now is developers would create the bones of an application, and Martin the marketer can come in and configure things.
Right, but I meant like, how does he configure it? Like, if this is what I see on my page, how do I configure the visual parts of it? Do I have a special editor that I use that you guys have like on Hub or something?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
And we have sort of a visual concept for that.
Okay. I'm just trying to understand how it all fits together since we don't have the other pieces which are coming soon. So
yeah, exactly.
Trying to figure it out. That's all. Very cool
Understand.
stuff, though. And this is very detailed, which is great.
Well, cool. Yeah, ultimately, Martin the marketer would come in and have something that looks a lot like this guy right here, a timeline where he can, or she can, convert to symbol.
For those watching, the timeline is right below the stage, which is that white piece there.
Yep, this guy right here. And then we create a motion tween, and then here we move this over, and then we play the thing. Oh, maybe my flash is a little rusty. Oh, there we go. Essentially something like this, where Martin the marketer can come in and adjust animations in a very visual way.
Cool.
Would you like to see more demos? Would you like to dig a little more into sort of the container model for hosting and deployment?
I think both. If there's more of like the similar, if there's anything different in some of the other demos, we should go through that. If there's not as much different, then maybe we go to talk about deployment and how you would set that up.
Maybe I'll just show another. So here's a simple example of a lifecycle event. As with any sort of application framework, there are lifecycle events that you want to react to. For example, initialization. So like when an application loads, you want to fire some event. So in this case, when the application loads, this kicks off a set of animations, which are reflected here. Pretty simple stuff, but also very powerful. Repeat. So this one's an interesting one. One of the things we do very differently with our tree versus a lot of traditional MVC and front-end web frameworks today is there is zero templating in the tree, in the sense that if this were Angular, we might have like an ng repeat equals blah in blahs. And then you come in and you have your blah is great, something like that. Rather than, and what this is essentially is control flow of a render tree. So back to this guy, what we have here is a render tree. What ng repeat is saying I want a dynamic number of elements who are, say, children of this particular node based on some data model, right? So if there are 3 blahs in my blah list, then there should be 3 children on this element. Ngif, similarly, is essentially control flow. If blah. So if blah is true, then this subtree should be turned on. If blah is false, then this subtree should be turned off. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So rather than do all this stuff inline, which really pollutes the notion, well, again, one of our hard constraints is that our tree, that the declaration of our tree is strictly declarative. The moment we start sort of polluting that with control flow like this, we lose that declarativeness and we have sort of a pollution of concerns. So instead, just like behaviors size and align are joined onto the line element via selector, the repeat control flow itself is simply joined onto the line element by selector. So this is a very sort of functional, in the sense of functional programming way to think about it. What we do is we repeat, it's a function that returns the data model that should be bound to the control flow for this particular node. So it's return blah in that ng repeat example, or I guess blahs. It's return the data model that should be repeated over, but then this subcomponent is able to make use of whatever aspect of that blah it needs to, again, functionally. So you're funneling functions through functions. And that's what behaviors are all about, is an approachable functional programming paradigm that can be used to describe the behaviors of an application. So to make that a bit more concrete, here is a simple application of repeat for this example.
So you're changing it from 24 to 360?
And here's what it's doing with that. So for each I, it's pushing an object where I is the value of I here. And then it returns that. So we have an array of 360 of these guys. Also associated with these elements is an index. So as we repeat this UI element 360 times, this rotation Z and the style behavior are bound individually to each iteration of that repeat. So for UI element index 0, this behavior will be bound with the value 0. For index 1, it will be bound with index 1. So for each child of this render tree, this is going to be index 0, this is going to be index 1, this is going to be index 2. This is going to have a rotation of 1 360th, or I guess 0 360th of pi, and then 1 360th of pi, and then 2 360th of pi. And the style is going to be an HSL cycle just from 0 to 360. So let's see what that looks like. Here we go. If we change this back to 24, there'll be 24 of these guys instead of 360. If we change it to 180, there'll be 180 of these guys instead of 360. Is that clear?
Yeah, I think for people who aren't as familiar with Famous, as far as the render trees go, Angular with the repeats will do it one at a time, but correct me if I'm wrong, but Famous and like abstractions like React will try and piece it in at the fewest amount of changes at the most optimal moment. Am I correct? I'm not familiar with Angular 2 yet, so I don't know that, but for Angular 1.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. We've optimized like crazy. Our engine team they are crazy good at optimizing JavaScript down to the inner loops, and down to the garbage collection cycles. So yes, and we batch changes aggressively. I think the key difference here is thinking iteratively, like procedurally, versus thinking functionally. So one of the paradigms that the best paradigm, or that the best architecture pattern brings to the table, is that these behaviors are functions in the sense of functional programming. You should think of your data set as an entire set that you operate on in parallel, essentially, versus something that you would iterate over procedurally.
Right. So yeah, so some beginners may be looking at this going, why is there a normal for loop and not a for each? And for loops are much more performant, and yeah, there's a lot of reasons why you would code it this way for sure.
Mm-hmm. And in this case, the for loop is just a convenience method for filling out I is 0,
yeah,
I is 1, down to 360. But essentially, it's a data model. If we do that, there should just be 2 lines.
Very colorful.
So yeah, that might be about it for the framework. Again, we are releasing this in private beta starting tomorrow, actually. But we request that people come on site so that they can work directly with the framework team for anyone who wants early access to this, because we still have some road testing to do, and we still expect some user feedback. But yeah, anyone who wants private beta access, and you can just email me, Zach, Z-A-C-K, @famous, that's FAMO.US.
So only people who come in can have access right now for the betas?
For now, yeah. Okay. We will open up. We'll open up the gates from there. We're following a one, some, many, all methodology on getting this out there, and so we're gauging our project preparedness based on these criteria.
I have a question that might be a little sensitive. I don't know. So if you can't answer it, that's fine. But why not just put it all out in the open, since it's going to be MIT licensed anyway? Why not expose it and have people help fix any of those problems with you to help you?
So I hear you. I'll point to this methodology as sort of the main answer there. In short, there can be too many cooks when a project is nascent like this. Okay. There are a lot of opinions. It's the nature of front-end web development. In fact, too many opinions sometimes. And there are a lot of there can be a lot of noise in trying to serve the needs of everyone too soon. So this methodology is starting with one, and then expanding that to some in a private on-site beta, and then expanding that to many in a more public beta, and then just going full on. All is essentially 1.0. This is essentially public, but beta, and then some is our private beta, and then this is our internal alpha. This is the stage we're at now. This is what we are rolling out tomorrow. This is what we will be launching as soon as we feel comfortable that the too many cooks problem can be resolved, and then this will be 1.0.
Okay, I can totally understand that. I mean, when I do my own stuff, I usually have a private repo first, and then I'll put something out, but that it'll be early in the stages for my work. So that's why I ask. So it'll be like if I don't worry about performance or anything like that. I just put it out there if it works, and then somebody can come take a look. So I can understand though. I know Facebook and Google, they have a lot of projects like that where they have it, private for a little bit, and then they put it out totally for everybody. So, okay, that makes sense.
Cool. And I think we wanted to talk a little bit more about the deployment model, kind of the thing we were thinking about. We're trying to approach this to kind of target, the two different segments. We want to definitely target developers, definitely when we're developers that are doing, creating their own widgets, creating, large scale applications and stuff like that in there. And then also, like we've been talking about, like the marketers, the low code, no code people and stuff like that. So through our Hub Cloud services, our first initial offering, which will be actually pushing out the CLI, which will hook up to it eventually. We have a CLI that's going to be used with famous projects, with like the seed project and everything else, to be able to create like your first project and be able to push it up and see it in an embeddable container. So that's actually going to be going out tomorrow. So we're doing that for developers. Yeah, exactly. So it's going to be sort of like, like we've talked about a little bit like Heroku thing, where it's a very simple interface. You init your project, you have your seed and all that, you can start coding, and then when you have something, go ahead and push it up to a container, which it will return basically a link to where you can view your container, because it will immediately be live on a share link that you can pull up then, and then also an embed tag that you can put on any of your sites, so you can start coding right away and figuring that out. And then you can push changes as fast as you want and play around with it. And then we're also we've been talking about the IDE and everything else that's going to be available through the Hub Cloud Services platform to allow people to kind of visually create stuff that maybe don't have the coding skills or just want to do quick changes. And then we're also going to have sort of like an interface on the actual containers where you can, as Zach was showing with that one screen, where you could make small changes to them and save those changes without needing to go to a separate web page or something like that. If if you're authenticated and you own this one and you have permissions to make changes to it, you can make changes right on the site and see what it is. And when you like it on your own browser, you can save it, and then it will show up for everyone type of thing.
Okay.
So
that's
yeah,
awesome. You can see how designers would be really into a lot of the visual tools for that. Because Flash, I started on Flash 2 with design, and I started to get into some of the action script, and that's when sort of I just dove right into JavaScript full force.
Yep, exactly. And we just want to take a lot of like the burdens and the pain points of deploying these things out. Like, when you deploy something out, you have to host it somewhere. You have to make sure that it loads performantly. You have to worry about compressing your assets and doing all these other things like that. And we're trying to basically provide this kind of one-stop shop of all these different services that that when you push your application out and you put this embed link on your page, that your application that you've just created is going to load quickly, that it's going to be as optimized as possible, a number of other things, so that you just, like you said with like Heroku, hey, I want to push a Rails application out. I don't have to worry about provisioning my own server and setting up Rails and all that. It's already done for me. And that's what we're kind of trying to do here with the front end stuff.
Yeah, the whole idea of containers really is awesome. I think I use Vagrant a lot, and that's very useful to wrap up a lot of the dependencies for like Node and Ruby. So I can totally see this would be very useful. For as far as like worst case scenario for getting it out, I know timelines happen. There's changes and things get messed up. I've been there like a million times. So how What's the worst case scenario where people will have total access to this, to get to that one level, like you pointed out, Zach?
Well, to the 1.0 itself.
Well, you said you have the many and the private, the sum, and then you have the one. So like where everybody has total access of to the latest code.
Yeah. People wiser than I have answered this question with, it will be ready when it's ready.
Yes, I've heard that before. That's awesome.
Yeah. What we are doing is iterating and sort of rolling with the punches. If we find that something needs to be pulled back, we just pull it back and then roll out what we can.
And I think it's just the stuff you guys are doing is amazing. It's like, we're salivating and we want to play with it. So it's like you guys have done incredible work, but it's hard to say, oh, how does this fit into my workflow? How can I, play with this and integrate it when we can't have access yet, which is why I ask.
Gotcha. Yeah, framework. I
don't want to get you fired, man. I don't want to get you fired.
I mean, if I don't make the deadlines, I'm fired anyway. That's my job. So I'm comfortable saying within 2 to 3 months, hopefully sooner, that public beta will be out there. The 1.0 bit is where I would say, like, the definition of 1.0 is so fluid. We are releasing mixed mode itself. Steve just sent out a newsletter actually on right before this podcast. So this is official now. I can say this. We are releasing mixed mode tomorrow in public beta. So that's our core engine.
So we'll see it on GitHub.
Yep. Fully MIT.
Full access.
Yep.
And what will be the name of that repo? Will it be mixed mode?
Probably not. Famous/engine. So again, we have the famous open source project with the engine layer and the framework layer. So famous, github.com/famous/engine is where it should be.
Very cool. Since that was published, you're not going to get fired. Just say, Eric made me say it. Okay.
Okay. I'm sure that'll work.
Okay. And Steve will unfollow me on Twitter. We all Okay. So thank you guys. Is there other code that we should be looking at so that for like integration with the engine at all, or should we be talking about looking at the other container stuff, or is this pretty much what we have for now? And then when the next iteration of this comes out, we can look more.
I'd say the latter. This is what we got for now. There's that API preview code, and then mixed mode will be out tomorrow. So you can roll up your sleeves and you can start building stuff in mixed mode tomorrow. And then anyone who's interested again in private beta access, sort of early developer preview access to the frameworks, just reach out and we will see what we can do.
Okay. And on the YouTube channel you guys have for Famous, is there other videos that we should be watching to get a further grasp of all of these pieces, and especially front-end containers?
To my knowledge, we don't have a lot of videos out there yet. This is sort of this might be one of the most in-depth sort of developer-focused.
You heard it here.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly. Exclusive.
This is it, people. Okay. All right. Well, thank you guys. If people have questions, they want to talk to you further about this, or sign up for the private beta, how can they find you guys?
Yeah. So I'll screen share one more time. Are you okay putting your email address?
Yes, that too. And we should also mention the Slack channel.
Oh, of course.
Oh, gotta have a Slack. I'm on that Slack channel. Put that on there.
So you can just go to slack.famous.org.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. /. And that'll prompt you to join our Slack community. And right now, I turned off Slack for this podcast. But
Slack decides to connect.
I love Slack. Slack is such a productive tool.
It is great.
Distracting for some things, but very, very powerful.
So we already have a number of people on here. And yeah, you're welcome to join this community, and the core engineering team's on here as well. Pretty much the whole company is on here. So anyone who wants to reach out can do so through Slack.
All right. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. This has been really awesome, and I'm looking forward to the crazy awesome stuff you guys are building, because every time I talk with Steve or someone else from the Famous community, I'm like, whoa, nobody else is doing that. That's pretty awesome. So yeah, thank you.
We're using web standards that already exist to build the tools that we think the web should have, right? It's all about the passion for creating stuff and for empowering designers and developers and marketing people alike to create stuff for the web.
Yep.
Cool. All right. We'll see you all next month.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Okay.